We left off talking about cubism, right? Analytic cubism, the earlier of the two parts of cubism, and we were talking about, on one level, the agenda, which is primarily aesthetic, it's not at all political, which is to bridge the gap between the idea of the painted subject and the painting as an object, right? The painting as a surface. And as Picasso's dealer said, that one of the ways that they had tried to do this was to permeate anything that was solid, right? Make solids look transparent, but then to also make anything that should be transparent look solid, whether it's air or glass or whatever. So it becomes difficult to tell whether you're looking at the positive object or the negative space around it, right? And that's the way to knit together these elements into something that reminds you of the surface of the painting. That's how you find the balance between the idea of the painted subject and the object of the painting. And one of the things that we see as we look at Cubist art is that there are particular subjects that they tend to like. Oddly, the nude woman is not one of them. That was a special work. It falls out of the norm for Cubist art in that it was a commissioned work, right? For never completed commission for this decorations for a library. However, with the Braque etching on your left, we see much more normative, traditional subject matter for analytic cubism, and that is scenes that come out of the cafe experience, which I think in many ways can be seen as a microcosm of living in the modern world, the idea of the cafe, right? In modern Paris. Those cafes didn't exist before Paris was redesigned in the middle of the 19th century, so they could be seen as spending a day at the cafe with a beer and a cigarette and a glass of wine and the newspaper. That's all sort of part of being part of modern Paris. So it's a modern subject matter. But over and above that, this idea of beer bottles and labels and signs that are a list of wine, you know, and the newspaper, all of those can be seen as sort of, what do you want to say, they're analogs for making art in a way. Because when you make art, you put something on a surface, right? And that's what you do with a beer label. That's what you do with a newspaper. That's what you do with a menu of wines, the carte au vin, right? Is the same idea. Even things like a tablecloth can be seen as that, or linoleum, or wallpaper. You know, these things can be seen as analogs for the artistic practice. So there's something to be said for the Cubist object, the kinds of things that they choose to make these works out of, right? In addition to that, we're not going to see that much of it because of the local selection of works, but music is also a huge part of it. We saw a guitar player right at the end of class on Tuesday. And for that, of course, we've seen the idea of music being an important metaphor for other modernist artists, whether it's Matisse dancing and pipe players, or Kandinsky's idea of painting sound, right? How he said that blue was the sound of a cello and all this. The idea of music as a metaphor for modern art is a really strong one here and earlier as well. Whistler, James Whistler, Whistler's mother, right, made a connection between painting and music because music was seen to be abstract and all about simply composition. So if you name your works after music or use musical elements, are you then bridging that gap between the arts, you know, and coming to that sense of perfect harmony that music already has, right? Okay. So this is analytic cubism. This is the first phase, 1909-ish to around 1912, where Picasso and Braque are sharing a studio together, right? They've been brought together by their dealer. They have the same art dealer. He's the one that suggests you work side by side, right? I want to take a second and step back a bit to talk about how they got here, but very, very briefly. Not going to go way back, right? Because how they got here is somewhat important. Even though Picasso is more famous when we talk about Cubism, right? The one you always hear about, Picasso and Cubism, right? A lot of experts think that Braque had a lot more to do with it than people really ever gave him credit for. That many of the ideas that lay at the heart of Cubism are Braque's ideas, right? And in fact, he takes the initial steps toward Cubism before he starts to share a studio with Picasso. Now that said, Picasso's taking some steps as well. That's what brought them together, right? But it's not like Braque is riding on Picasso's coattails. Or the other way around, really. Remember the metaphor. We were mountain climbers tied together, ropes together, right? And no one's always leading, right? One is always leading above the other. Here is a Braque from slightly earlier, done in 1908 from the National Gallery, where you can see he's really hammering into sort of Cubist ideas. It's a view of boats in a harbor, right? But he has totally fragmented the surface and turned everything into these individualized cubic shapes, so that the background around the central pole of the mast of that one boat in the middle, everything in the background just simply breaks up, right? Yes, I am. Thank you for asking. Yes, I am recording. And so you can make out certain things, right? You can make out, for example, there's a sail here, right? But then if you look at what happens around that, the areas, for example, in here and then in here, doesn't seem to work. It seems to break up, and even the ocean itself seems to lay out there in small sections, so that ocean's transparent, right? Well, not everywhere, right? Around the Potomac it tends not to be so much, but in the Mediterranean it is. And he's turned those transparent areas into things that look almost as if you can't tell whether it's solid or translucent or transparent, right? And that's typical for these steps toward Cubism and become a central part of the Cubist project. Even the sky above, right? And it's hard to tell if that meant to be sky or, if you've ever been to the south of France, the hills, the mountains kind of rise directly out of the ocean in many places, right? There are these bays, like Monte Carlo, for example, which just goes straight up from there. And so when we look at this area sort of back in here, that could well be the side of the hill rather than the sky in the background. But again, I don't think that Braque is really so much worried about that, describing what he sees, as he's worried about knitting these different elements together so that the subject ends up not being a single thing anymore, right? That everything is fragmented, and really what's the point of painting is to make the composition, to knit these different elements together after you've analyzed them and figured out how they fit, right? So this is where Braque is already going, these sort of greenish brown paintings, and you can even see elements here, like this bit down here, that remind you very, very much of what we saw with the Portuguese, and even how he handled areas like down in here, right? Where he's already doing that with Dave, 2 or 3 years earlier, the things that we'll end up seeing in his Cubist work. So this is kind of a proto-Cubist work, right? It's not really, Cubism hasn't been quite labeled yet as such, right? But it's still associated with Cubism. It's on the road to it, right? This is kind of why I'm not having you identify periods with the slides, because some of them aren't really there yet, you know what I mean? But it's associated with that, because that's where the artist is headed. Now, Braque is interesting because he began as a Fauve. He was part of the Fauve group. And also down at the National Gallery, basically the same subject matter, right? This massive harbor at La Ciotat, where we have in the foreground the sort of fishing harbor with the boats laid up on the sand, right? And in the background, I think those are cruise ship towers, right, or smokestacks. But then they kind of look like that. There's a large. So I don't know enough about shipping, 1907. When are we getting on things? Where are things like the Queen Mary and things like that? That's the only way it got across the ocean at this point, right? I mean, when in the middle of the 19th century, people like Winslow Homer and Thomas Aiken, our artists, right? Even earlier, right? Thomas Jefferson, way before the Industrial Revolution. Jefferson goes to Paris. How did he get there? He's not flying, right? And he's not out that row in a boat. So there's got to be something to take him. And I think steamships are fairly common. And you can see that there's even large maps back there, so you get the sense of all of these different kinds of boats, and the large ocean harbor behind those houses, and the smaller sort of fishing harbor in the foreground. But for us, the important issue is the fact that he's right alongside Matisse, right? And André Durand, and Maurice de Fleming. He's another of the Fauves. What happens to Braque is the year after the Fauves begin, right? He sees this massive retrospective of the works of Cézanne. Now, Cézanne is this amazing figure in that he means all things to all people, Cézanne, for some people, they take this element of Cézanne, they go that direction with him. Other people take other elements, go that direction. So we actually already mentioned Cézanne when it came to the Fauves, didn't we? His idea of divorcing color from description was an important idea for the Fauves. They take it further. They divorce it further from observed, objective reality, right? He's a touchstone for them. But he's also a touchstone in other ways, in that the way in which he fragments the surface of the picture, the way in which he turns what he observes into these patches that we saw when we looked at him, can also be seen as the basis of Cubism. And when Cézanne died in 1906, right, they organized in Paris a huge retrospective of his work. It was finally mounted in 1907, right, to honor the passing of the great artist of the last quarter century. Okay, now others are still around. Monet lives like till the 20s, Degas around till after World War I. These guys, but Cézanne passes and people recognize that a great master has fallen. And Braque goes to the show, right? He's already painting as a Fauve, and he sees something else in Cézanne that he had never seen before. And that's that sense of cubic structure that I think we saw slightly when we looked at him very closely, right? So here is his famous Mont Saint-Victoire, which he paints all the time. But he's painting it from a view inside of a rock quarry, right? This is where stones are cut for local construction. And focuses on those reddish rocks with the green that we see here and in the foreground here, and takes that idea of the crystalline stone and uses it as a motif to build the structure of the trees, to build the structure of the mountain, or even of the sky for that matter. To the point where if you look in the lower right corner, just down in here, right, you can see that the spaces between the branches of the trees almost become themselves rectilinear rock forms, because he's come back and you've seen him do this in other works where he'll paint the background after the foreground. And he'll sort of blur the transitions between these two, right? The foreground becomes background. Remember when we looked at the large phasers? We saw how the background kind of turned into that woman's back, the one from Philadelphia. Well, that's kind of what Braque and Picasso will end up doing. Is they'll take that idea of, okay, he's broken it down for us. He said that foreground can be background, background can be foreground, right? Positive can be negative, negative can be positive, solid can become transparent, transparent can become solid. He's there already in 1880, right? But it's this retrospective in 1907 that opens people's eyes to it. And somebody asked Picasso, who was also working independent from Braque at that time, right? Asked him, what do you think about this Cézanne show? And Picasso's famous comment, everybody quotes it, he was the father of us all. In other words, there's nothing we're going to do that he hasn't already done, right? Which is, to this day, Cezanne is referred to more or less as the father of modern art. So this is, I chose this one in particular. There's quite a few images from the Beavis Quarry, but I chose this one because it's up at the Baltimore Museum of Art, just up in Baltimore. So again, trying to stick with local works of art. Okay? Now, this inspires Braque to begin painting in a new manner, in a manner that emulates certain aspects of some Cezanne pictures and pushes those elements further. Right? So it's almost as if he's taken this part of the composition down here and turned it into the entire composition, where it's that limited tone between grays and red or brownish reds, umbers, and greens. And I think that that's a bit hot, you know what I mean, insofar as the color scheme is concerned. I didn't take that picture, I downloaded it. I think that's a little on the sort of incandescent light side of things. Now, the colors of these tend to be significantly closer to what we're seeing in Braque's work here. Right? Well, 1908, so he sees the Cezanne exhibition. He's been exhibiting with the Fauves, right? 1907, he exhibits with the Fauves. 1908, he comes back to the group and he says, I got something new. Because the Fauves, you know, at one point they were kind of working shoulder to shoulder. They were working on similar things with color, but they didn't really have a manifesto, right? They didn't have, you didn't have to do things in a particular way to be part of that avant-garde group. So Braque comes back in 1908 with these things like this that are influenced by the rocks of Cezanne. He says, I want to put these in the show. And Matisse, of all people, says, this is ridiculous. These are ugly. You're painting nothing but a bunch of little cubes, he says. Right? There's the term. Right? And he says, I don't want these with our stuff. We're involved with color. You're going somewhere else. And this led a critic used it to take Matisse's criticism, you're painting nothing but a bunch of little cubes. Take that and turn it into the new term, cubism. Right? And interesting in the press, right, that Braque is doing cubism. Interestingly, the same critic who came up with the term cubism, was the same critic who came up with the term Fauvisme, Fauves, right? Exactly that. But they both turn around ideas that Matisse was working with, right? And his own criticism of what art should be doing. So, in 1908, with the Salon d'Automne, the Fall Salon, the Autumn Salon, we begin to see Braque break away from the Fauves and move toward taking these steps towards something entirely different, right? Now, you might remember from intro that famous Picasso of the Young Ladies of Avignon, the prostitutes, right? Which is also very cubist, different color range, right? That's 1907, right? So he's working in very similar ideas, but nobody ever saw it. It was never shown in public. And it disappeared for the next 20 plus years, right? After turning to a similar direction, it's Braque and Picasso's dealers who set him up. Put him in the same studio, working side by side. And Picasso just starts to do the stuff that Braque was doing. Same color scheme, right? Umbers, forest greens, different subject matter. In this case, is the tabletop, right? But it's very easy to see where the two of them now have roped themselves together to scale the cliff of cubism. And within months, they begin to break new ground together. But Braque deserves an awful lot of credit, because Picasso begins to emulate a style that Braque had begun prior to getting together. And prior to this, Picasso's not doing that color scheme, right? They're working side by side. They're moving their way up the hill. So I want to be sort of contrarian here and really talk a bit more about Braque, because I really quite like him. Picasso gets lots of press, you know? And we'll talk about Picasso. Don't worry about that, right? But I want to also talk about other things about Braque that are kind of interesting. Braque is also credited with the next big step in Cubism. So he's credited with getting us to analytic Cubism in the first place. right? Or helping, playing a big role in that. He's also credited with playing a huge role in getting us past analytic cubism to the next big step. And we already saw on Tuesday with the Portuguese, the guitar player, that he's stenciling right on the surface of the canvas, right? He's breaking down that distinction between art and label making even, you know? This pushes us to the next step of the idea. Once you start to stencil things, why don't you just glue things on the canvas instead? Why don't you just tack them down? And in fact, Braque is credited with sort of developing collage, even though you almost always hear the Picasso do. Braque, I think, was there first. Again, they're side by side, so it's really impossible to tell. But Braque was the one who introduced the idea of stenciling. And that's what leads us to the idea of collage, which really didn't exist as an art form prior to Cubism. There aren't a lot of collages out there at this time. And this ushers in the second phase. 1912 or so, we begin to see collages. And the second phase of Cubism, where you start to bring disparate elements together. Rather than first area of Cubism, you look at the unified whole and you break it apart, right? That's the analytic part of analytic Cubism. The second part of Cubism takes different elements and brings them together. Now, in each case, the artist is attempting to give you a sense of the experience beyond the simple visual experience. The experience through elapsed time. Right? But this new phase, where disparate elements are brought together, is labeled by them synthetic Cubism, where the primary action is synthesizing, bringing things together that don't belong together, making a synthesis. This is the second phase of Cubism, is synthetic Cubism. So the first phase, ushered by the Harbor, for example, is where you look at the world and break it apart. You analyze it down to these cubes that you reassemble. The second phase, synthetic Cubism, you bring disparate things together into the composition. You make them synthesize on the surface. Right? Synthetic Cubism. And it's a logical step from what we saw Braque already doing. Not only the stencils that we saw in the Portuguese painting of the guitar player, but even prior to that, with the image we started out with today, Bass, right? Where he's not only giving us the sense that the Bass label has been removed from the bottle and somehow transplanted into his etching, that the menu of the wine or the sign was, maybe, Frisian bars, right? They tell you what they've got in the way of wine in two different ways. One's the menu, the type of that. The other one is a board on the wall with chalk, on it. And so our word there with that big rivet next to it probably suggests something that was on the wall. Yeah? And add to that the wood grain in the upper right corner, right? This bit up here, where he's simulated wood grain as well. All of these elements end up sort of prophesying synthetic Cubism. It's the logical next step. Why draw the wood grain when I can go get a piece of sticky paper? Wallpaper, wood grain wallpaper, and slap that onto the canvas. Right? Why bother to draw it? Why bother to draw a label of a Bass beer, Bass ale, when I can go and, run it under some hot water, get it off of there, and stick it down? Right? Everything, of course, but the bottles, but all the two-dimensional stuff that was really fascinating them can now be put directly here. So in our aria de Bach, a Bach aria, Bach the composer, right? Is he Baroque? What do we call him? Baroque composer, right? One of his arias, he's actually laminated down pieces of textured paper. and then drawn over the top of them with what appears to be the libretto or the music for the aria of Bach, right? I guess as an aria is sung, it would be the libretto, right? And shaded it to look as if it's sitting there in the same way we see pieces of the newspaper in the bathroom, right? And he's also drawn over the top of it a guitar so that it becomes confusing as to where that black is supposed to be, behind or in front. But again, the Cubist objects, right? They love guitars. They love bottles and glasses. And again, we mentioned this on Tuesday. The guitar, right, presents space in a way that you see it and you see through it at the same time. Right? It's a box that has a hole in it, strings that float in front of it, that allow it to give you this complex space that is rich with possibilities for composition. He's again broken it apart, right? So we see half of the guitar on the right. The strings, when they hit the hole, disappear, which is the one place where you see the strings most obviously, is against that black hole. On the left-hand side, we pick up elements from the composition of the guitar. Half of the hole again, maybe something suggested by the neck, right? But disembodied, fragmented, because we still have that idea of the way in which we experience our world through time, which is not as a unified whole, but as these glimpses that come together. Right? And with that coming together are these different textured elements, right? Now with Bach, one of the things that's fascinating about him for Brock is exactly what just came out right there. Brock knew their names sounded the same. And there are dozens of pictures where the word Bach is in there. Because he sees, I think, that what he's doing is a painter, composing, synthesizing different elements. It's like what Bach did as a composer, where music from different instruments comes together to make a whole. Right? And in a way that isn't narrative and isn't related to the world around us in a way. It's abstract and it transports us. And that's what Bach or Brock wants to do as well. So he's really quite fascinated with the works of Bach. I would tell you this, if you saw an unknown slide and the Cubist and had Bach in it somewhere, good chance it's Brock, right? How's that for? Drop one out there for you guys, right? Well, Picasso immediately jumped on this idea as well and kind of pushes it a bit further too. And here we see down here, I think this is meant to be the tabletop. This would be the base of the table down below. Here, sorry about that. Right? And then we see other elements of the room. So we see the strings coming off of the tablecloth here, right, and over here as well. And then we also see a fragment of the tablecloth, actually glued to the upper left corner, and a fragment of the wallpaper, glued down again. Pulling in these elements that reflect the experience, synthesizing them together in a composition that evokes without actually illustrating. Right? That's the hallmark of Cubism, I think. And you can see he plays with the three-dimensionality of it. Eventually, Picasso will turn to sculpture as well. Loves sculptures of guitars, where he suggests space through planes and the way that they hang. And so that piece of blue paper, I've not seen this in person, right? But the piece of blue paper seems to separate from the background. And the cup of coffee, right? Where's the cup of coffee? Two places, kind of, right? That torn piece of paper, right? This one right here, with the handle on the side. Yeah? The silver one as well, right? And the silver one is weird because the round bit, which would be the hole probably in it, or maybe it's the handle. Well, you can't tell. It doesn't matter, right? It's been divorced from that to make a composition there. Again, multiple points of view, right, along with multiple materials to evoke the different experiences. Yep. People have suggested, however, that the big silver one, Tracy, that you were just talking about, might also make an allusion to a guitar, because you start to see it abstractly, right? I think the divorcing, right, he's using it as part of the inspiration for how he lays it out without actually saying it's really there, you know? About this bit up here?
In the wallpaper, see where the little sheets are joining?
Oh, sure enough, exactly, got it. Yeah, I didn't see that. Stupid reading glasses. This bit right here, when you see it with that, make it even stronger, doesn't it? As a superimposition, right, of the guitar form. Good eye. This is the problem with sitting over here, right? If I was sitting out there, then we could do this. But I'm tethered still. I want them to buy me like a Roku stick to stick in there, or an Apple TV thing, so that then this would wirelessly just communicate directly with that, and I could sit out there with you guys. You know, wouldn't that be a lot better? Anyway, long and the short of it is, it's again the standard Cubist idea of cafe life, right? Connection between art and music, these purified forms of the Cubist life, the guitars, the bottles, coffee cups, right? All share that idea of being a sort of form that has already been simplified, right? Already been sort of standardized in a way. And these become the stuff of your Cubist compositions. Do you remember this one from Intro? It's another collaged work from the synthetic series where actually you can see, I got a slightly better picture here. This is a real tabletop, right? An oval tabletop from a cafe that he's taken and glued things to, and then painted over the top of, and added a rope as a frame around the outside. So what he's done is he's taken all these elements that are from the actual experience, just like the wallpaper and the tablecloth on the right are, but a little bit more literalist almost, in that he's got the tablecloth, he's got the rope that separates the table from the sidewalk outside, right? You've seen this at cafes. Think about a club, right, where how you separate the line from the people walking on the sidewalk. And then this bit here is the webbing from the seat of the chair painting, with old bentwood furniture. They would have stretched over it this filament of sort of it's like gut. It's like what they make tennis racket strings from. And he's actually taken and glued it down to the surface. He's cut it out of a chair and stuck it down there so that you can actually see, if you look at it in detail, that some of the brush strokes, you can still see the texture of it underneath the painting. So again, I'm not seeing this one in person. It's in the Picasso Museum in Paris. Right? But you can still see where that's a three-dimensional thing underneath. You know, picking up the paint here underneath it. So you glued all these elements down and then painted over the top of it with other things that again suggest the cafe experience, our standard Cubist object, like the word jus again, journal, right? But also remember that erotic double entendre, right? Sexual play, foreplay, right? Yeah, it's that as well. Cigarette, which seems to be actually burning. I guess glasses, not these kind of glasses, but drinking glasses, coffee cups, cut citrus fruit, relating to the idea that you're sitting there all day long eating. People suggested that this is a cone that you can give yourself pepper and cones. Before they had shakers, right? You would come out with a little thing like a sway. The only thing you would get, you just hold pepper and you can shake it out of that instead. And that little piece of triangular paper on the right may well relate to that earlier. So again, it's all about this collaging, right? But it's going more than just a simple collage. It's a collage with paint. So the idea of the collage is not just the object itself, but it's manipulated by the artist. It's an important part of synthetic They never just simply chunk a bunch of freaking math together and do this alone. They're always working over the top of it. So that instead of starting with a blank slate, right, instead of just starting with a canvas, this is not my notes. This is the right? So if you think about it, let's go back to analytic cubism, right? Remember what the Elon Kahnweiler said about analytic cubism. It's all about this tension between the surface, right, the object, and the thing that is being touched. Right? There's a problem here. There's a thing that needs to be worked through, an idea that needs to be worked through. So going even back to analytic cubism, the idea of the surface of the painting was always kind of on their mind, right? And they made compositions wherein they could make you aware of that. But they were starting from a blank slate, right? They were starting from a blank canvas. Nothing more than a blank slate, okay? Now they're starting from something else. Now they're starting from a synthesized surface, right? Where they're going to do something to the surface first. Maybe this is the new solution, right? How do you solve the tension between the surface of the painting and the thing you're going to do? Where's the muck of the surface to begin with? Where's the change step? Where's the change the rules of the game? Right? So that the surface itself is no longer a problem of painting. And then I come over and paint over whatever I want, and I don't have to worry about all this. You know? Because that's all the way. Broken down. That issue of the object. I say an object. Now I'm going to paint the object. And you can sort of see it. That's the idea that's driving this, right? That's the thought behind it. Move towards it. You can see my move. It just makes sense. And that question about the relationship between painting and sculpture is really old. And anybody who's ever studied art history anyway, and in the early 20th century, it took a lot more of it. But you realize that the dialogue between painting and sculpture is Michelangelo and Leonardo in the Renaissance about which was better, right? Painting or sculpture. Painters can paint landscape. Sculptures can do three dimensions. A painter can do something else while he's painting. Sculptures can do it. You know, this is kind of the stuff of it. And Picasso's beginning to work with the distinction between the two, bringing them together in a very interesting way. That he's dealing with canvas as a very sculptural object. Here, and with the slide we had before, where that blue paper separates from the surface. This is really kind of fascinating insofar as trying to come up with a modern art that deals with very traditional ideas, but in a new and interesting modern way. Over the painting, yeah, definitely. You can actually see, if you look over here on this side, you can actually see the pattern of the chair painting underneath the paint. The black behind you? I've heard that there's some oilcloth here. You know what oilcloth is? It's old tablecloth material that's a cloth that's actually been permeated with oil so that when you spill on it, it heats up, right? So I've heard that there's oil, I've read that there's oilcloth on this one. You can kind of see down here on the edge, right? But I think what he's done is he's laid the oilcloth to glue the chair painting to the oilcloth and then cut it. Not entirely exactly, right? And I think he's being consciously rough edge here, right? I mean, he wants you to know. But I could be wrong because he just shrunk I think the result. And that oilcloth could be pulled back a bit, right? From the paint. But then over the top of that, he's laid these large, very thick pieces of paint, right? Whether it appears to be the shadow of a cup or something, maybe, right? Or this element down here, but even when he's done that, you can see where the pattern of the chair painting still shows through, right? I gotta get back to chair painting. And even over here where the peak breaks up over the surface. In this part down here. What part of the chair? What do you mean by the chair? The caning itself, it almost does, right? And that's when you see it. You see my nose in this thing, right? And it was not, I was never able to fully answer the question until I saw this detail online that gave me that. He obviously can come back and paint these little shadows and figures that continue that. There's a texture. But it doesn't look as if you've ever seen one of these chairs, homemade with chair, right? If you've ever seen one of these things, the caning is pretty thick. I mean, if I could think of tennis racket, you know, maybe I'd try that. Gotta be thick enough to hold it your life. Right? Sorry. Well, anymore they tend to flatten out because once you get the weave that way, you don't need it to be effective. Anyway, I've been looking at the edges just trying to figure out what I'm hoping it doesn't work. The more I look at it, the more it almost looks, I don't know, I mean, did he put a piece of rope on over the chair caning and then rub it? I need to see it, right? I can't tell you this. I think the important element is the way in which he brought together these materials to make the surface into a panel. Covered up just over half of it, right? So that there is this very strong distinction between the bits that are painted, the bits that they are although Picasso is a great draftsman, the two terrific draftsmen, I don't think he came back to paint. I think there's something there. That if he rubbed it or what, I can't. What he did. My problem is, when I go to Paris, I tend to sit in a real cafe, because it's such a great city for me. And so we never, and I hate waiting in line. Right? We never have to wait in line here for museums. And so, the idea of waiting to get to the day practice, I mean, it's just like time wasting. The last person in the afternoon is actually that. This is true of any major museum in Europe. I noticed this with the Vatican. If I go to the Vatican, first day in the morning, there's a line around the door. Went back at 2 in the afternoon.
Trying to remember. What's that really famous cafe at the Champs-Élysées?
The do I go?
More like red.
Most of them look that way. The do I go refer to a lot of. Yeah, that's the one that's the really famous one. It sounds like two magnets. I can't remember what it means when I go not magnet. But in any event, obviously we have to spend a lot of time there. He was living on the Montmartre, which is full of cafes, the bars, and with neighbors with other artists who sing quite a few of them, people on it, right? At the same time, had to leave when the war broke out, or chose to leave when the war broke out. So, it's fascinating. Okay, let's move on because there's still more Cubism seen. There were other Cubist artists other than Picasso and Braque. And one of the most fascinating of these is Juan Gris. As you can tell from his first name, he's also a Spaniard, as was Picasso. And what we'll see with Gris and others is that Picasso and Braque inspired quite a bit of other artists to come to Cubism. Gris was born in Madrid, actually moved to Paris specifically to meet Picasso. Picasso had been in the news enough, making waves in the Parisian art scene, that in 1906, Juan Gris moves to Paris to hook up with the other great Spanish artists there. And ends up moving into the same neighborhood, literally just down the street from Picasso, and knew Picasso and Braque from a very early time. So he picks up very much on especially synthetic cubism, right? He starts making cubist paintings already in 1911, but it's the synthetic cubist stuff that we best remember him for. These manipulated collages. So in this case, this one from Richmond, right? We have pieces of packing paper, right, that have been manipulated. There's wallpaper that's wood grain. There's tobacco paper that was for wrapping tobacco in. You bought it in bulk, right? Not cigarette rolling paper, but just the packaging paper. And drew over the top of all of these with white wash, color down below, charcoal as well, so that we have these sort of semi-translucent elements. Can you make out the carafe and the glass? So the charcoal and the gouache are meant to give you the reflections and the shadows and the ways in which you see through them in the center of this, right? It says, and tobacco, I think it's meant to be elements that relate to smoking here and there, like the top of a pipe. But again, if you think about buying loose tobacco and smoking it more likely in a pipe than with rolled papers, right? But we saw, right? There's cigarettes over here too. Yeah. A pipe is another of these standardized objects, right? Purified. And have you ever seen a man's pipe? Not a corncob one, but one of the ones from the early 20th century. They're beautiful things, right? Polished myrtle wood, you know, and pieces of the stem tends to be in bakelite, you know. They're gorgeous. The problem with smoking is that all the stuff that you smoke with is so beautiful, you know, and they made it such a luxurious thing that, you know, my wife used to smoke it, so I bought a pipe, you know, and had it for the longest time, and then my heart went bad. Not that I smoked very much, but it's just like I'm not even smoke a little anymore, even though I love looking at pipes, you know, and the smell of pipe tobacco. And there's something sexy to cigarette holders and all of that. They make it sexy, lighters, you know. And anyway, our Gree understands that he brings a lot of that into the work with these beautiful modern forms that he has in his works. One of the things that Gree brings into his cubist compositions that we haven't seen much of before is color. A lot of it in synthetic cubist works, right? Picasso and Braque really kind of lost enriched color as they moved to analytic cubism, and even in synthetic cubism didn't really bring it back. But Gree does. These amazing burgundies and purples and greens and blues. And here it's not real wood grain paper, but he's faking it, right? He's laid down a piece of paper and drug across it with the wood grain in this section here, right? Has wood graining, but it's obviously not real wood grain coming off of a printing press somewhere. It's Gree himself playing with that piece of paper, drawing over the top of it as well with elements that outline another newspaper, a goblet, a glass goblet, where the perspective on the top of the goblet turns up at you again, and you can see the stem more clearly. Element of a pitcher, right up in here, for pouring cream, and various other things. Even the tile on the floor underneath the table on the right-hand corner, right? And the wood grain on the walls itself, the wainscoting are brought in. So again, it's this idea of multiple points of view that evoke the experience brought together. And with all of this, there are also these elements where the things that should be solid become transparent. So Le Journal extends over the purple or the burgundy on the right, but when it does, it turns transparent. When elements that look like other parts of the paper, for example through here, right, turn transparent. Solids aren't solid, even now, even within synthetic cubism. And over here, we've got a movie ticket, Sentinel, and that mask with the skull. That relates to a really popular series of movies that had just come out. Sentinel was a criminal mastermind like the guy behind Spectre in James Bond, right? Like Blofeld or someone like that. He's the criminal genius, the mastermind who is going to control the world. And in France, first it was a novel, and the novel was terribly popular, and then they started making movies. In 1950, you streamed them all on Netflix. There were like 6 parts to this. They started in 1913. They were still going on in 1915, and they were the Star Wars of their day, right? I mean, people were lining up to see these things because it was the story of this gentleman thief who's going to rule the world through crime. And the poster gives you a sense of that, right? Walking over Paris itself. And here, sitting at the cafe with your cup of drink, your journal, and you're either going to the movies or you've been to the movies. Again, that interest in entertainment. Right? The guitar is a symbol of entertainment as well. We don't have one here, but we've seen them in other Cubist works. I'm a huge fan of Juan Gris. I think his stuff is just really beautiful, you know? And precise. There's something about it that's sort of, he paints more in his synthetic works than Picasso or Braque do. And instead of actually including objects, he's often more likely to paint it instead. It's reversing, I think, to what happened in analytic cubism. So I look everywhere to figure out what is the inscription that's hidden behind the green bits here, right? What is this part here? I have no idea what that says. And then I can't tell the rest. I don't know, right? But we see him doing what he did over here, which is instead of giving us that part of the wall, we have the bricks of the wall transposed into blue. We have these elements that seem to be laid down on a tabletop or something that are simultaneously solid and void, simultaneously opaque and transparent. And he's doing something else here that is utterly fascinating. He's so interested in the paint, and I think when we think about the color, right? What is paint? One of the great properties of paint is color, right? He brings that back into these pictures in a way that Picasso and Braque aren't. But another property of paint is its tactile nature. And one of the things that Gris begins to do is to mix stuff into the paint so that it sits up on the surface. It's self-sculptural. So those green bits in the middle, I think it's got sand in it. And you can see the difference between those gloomy bits that cast a shadow and the sort of county green parts that are behind it. Again, these are all solutions to the same problem. The difference between the surface, the object of the painting, and the thing that you're trying to depict. And here's a totally different solution to that. Right? Build the paint up. Make the surface that much more obvious in a different way than just stenciling. Right? Turn the painting into sculpture. This influenced Picasso. This is up at the Krieger. Beautiful thing, where he's now very much like Gris, painting again. With bright, saturated colors, and instead of collaging, which was a hallmark of synthetic cubism, he's painting things to look like he's collaging them. So the newspaper is now broken up into 3 separate areas, the Jourmal. The pear on the table sliced through by those bits of pure color. And you can probably tell from looking that he too is mixing sand into this paint. Right? Here's the sandy bits that you can see picking up probably from what Gris has done. So this group is a really fascinating group in that they're really interested in various elements of paint. We'll wrap up today. We won't get to, I'll probably knock them off the list, not today. We'll come back to this another point. Picasso continues this trend of doing these painted versions of collages, right? That's what the thing in the Krieger is, the painted version of the collage. And as they move through the 1910s, Picasso continues to paint as if the way he organizes the composition were a collage of cut-up elements. Not necessarily cubist per se, right? Or at least not analytic cubist, but certainly closer to synthetic cubism, where the guitar is fragmented into a series of what appear to be cutouts. The sheet music refracting through the bottle, right? The tabletop seen from the top, but the legs from the side. All of these standard cubist elements, but everything painted, and with brighter colors that he probably picked up from Grieg. Braque also continues to work this same direction, again with elements mixed into the paint. Right? These are both local works, but they show where they're headed in the decades to follow. In this case, the table open, he still has the fake wood grain that we saw going all the way back to those prints on the front of the table and the top of the table. Again, the skewed perspective and the idea that things look collage but aren't. Right? Painted to look collage, what collage did for him, right? What the collage did was when he slapped it down and drew over the top of it, it changed the background while he's painting the object. Now he's painting to resemble that same idea. In 1914, Picasso and Braque separate. So these works are done after they're no longer working side by side. The Cubist moment, right, 1909 to 1914, is an important one for both of them, but they split up, so to speak. There's no sort of falling out or anything. The reason they split up in 1914 was because of the war, World War I. Braque was healthy. He had to enlist. He was drafted. Picasso was Spanish, living in Paris. He didn't have to enlist. He stayed on and continued to work there. Other artists were able to miss the war. Matisse tried to enlist, but he was sick. He had some health problem. They wouldn't let him in. Right? Picasso begins to work in a new direction, separate from Braque during those years, while Braque is serving in the military. That's why part of the reason Braque painting is so much later here. Right? Is he's got 4 years away, surviving the war. But what's fascinating about Picasso is in the years that follow, their breakup, if you will, and into the 20s, the Cubist experiment becomes incredibly important for him, but it's not the only thing he'll do. He starts to just branch out and become the most amazing chameleon of an artist you'll ever meet. Picasso from this point forward, especially in the 20s, where within a year, he's doing drastically different things. A year apart. Right? You start to get used to certain things about them, right? And you can pick them up because there's this kind of Picasso throughout his entire career. There's that kind of Picasso throughout his entire career where here, okay, he's a musician again, right? He's got the guitar. It looks like a synthetic cubist collage put together for the image of the harlequin. We have elements of background behind it. We have sand mixed into the paint. But look what else he's doing. These amazingly classical things where the outline, right, the contour line around the outside gives it such an amazing sense of three-dimensionality and sculptural qualities. Right? And highly decorative and really good. He's a terrific draftsman, Picasso is. Really good. You know? He chooses to turn his back on that and go in other directions. So, I think that's the place to stop, right? Picasso's learned from his experience, but he doesn't let it end him in for the rest of his life. He'll turn back to it frequently, right? But that's not all he does from this point forward. And goodness knows we could do a whole class on Picasso, right? Okay, Tuesday, right? At the meet front, as soon as you can get there in front of the, I'll send out an email or something, right? In front of the main house to go to the national, Friday, you're right. Tuesday we're here. right in front of the main house. One last quick thing, I'm going to turn off